everyone for showing up today. You have made our day a day to remember. There are gatherings such as this happening throughout the country. Big cities, small cities. I'm so happy that we have people in Lafayette who think enough about the issues that confront us to come out and have a voice. And that is what you're doing by being here today. You are having a voice. I've been getting a lot of inquiries from various people, and also our city councilman, Mr. Dwayne Lazard, who, by the way, was coming, but at the last moment called and had to cancel because of something that came up. But he too have been getting calls from people who are kind of fussing with him, asking him, why don't y'all take the statue down? Why don't you take the statue down? So I've been asked to explain why that statue is still standing up. The city of Lafayette wanted to move this statue to where our city hall is now in 1980. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy objected. They filed suit to prevent the city from moving it. During the course of the hearing, the city and administration went into back room. You know how to go into back rooms. And they made a deal. The deal is the statue would not be moved unless there's a road that needs to be built here, or unless the city wanted to sell the land. And so they went back in court and told the judge, hey, we got an agreement here, you know, and everything is cool, you know, we just want you to make sure that the statue doesn't get moved except under these two conditions. That encouraged the judge to issue an injunction. Injunction is a court order, okay? The court order or injunction is that that statue cannot be moved unless those two conditions prevail, one of the two prevail. Now, Move the Mindset has been the biggest supporter of moving this statue. However, there were 16 individuals who decided that we, the people of Lafayette, need to have a say in moving this statue. Those 16 people, I'm to be one of them, those 16 people filed suit to challenge the injunction and to have it nullified. Now, our case was supposed to come to court in January. The city attorney asked for a continuance, and it was given to him. So the next date was set for March. And then the virus moved in, and the courthouse was shut down, and everybody was off work. Finally, our third attempt to get into court will take place on August the 17th. We walk in the footsteps of Martin Luther King. We are peaceful and we are nonviolent. That is why I discourage anyone from damaging that statue in any way. That statue represents the hatred of people, certainly long ago, but as folks who don't want us to take the statue down, they say we don't want you destroying our history. We don't want to destroy your history. We want to preserve the history. but we want the whole history taught. There was a people from the African continent who were kidnapped from their homes, traveled across the Atlantic, and were enslaved by people of this country. Eventually, the vast majority of them wound up in the South. And the South gained all kinds of riches as a result of having free labor. The story, I'm trying to get to the point where the story of another race of people who were enslaved is part of the same story that this Confederate statue represents. The enslavement, the rape of young girls, the sale of babies for profit, working men, the average age of the lifespan of a black man during the course of slavery was 50 years. Average lifespan. There is a long history that is part of the Confederate history, and that story, we think, can best be told by moving the statue and creating the black history part of the story in a museum. So when you hear people talk about, I don't want you destroying our past, this represents our heritage, our history. That's the last thing we want to do is they have rewritten history by excluding the lifestyle of black people they enslaved. They have rewritten history. I have a statement I would like to read to you. It's been prepared. It's a time to learn a little history. The cheering, the clapping, the happiness, the celebration of Juneteenth will continue. But I think this is what I'm about to present to you is important as well. It doesn't include references to the statute. E pluribus unum, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. This has been our national motto since our nation's founding. Our nation has always been many, but we have never been one. The United States Declaration of Independence declared that all men, all people, are created equal. Yet it took a civil war to abolish slavery and finally amend our Constitution to provide equal protection of the laws. And still, that promise was not honored either. White people imposed by law and practice an intense system of anti-black segregation and educational and economic oppression. This system was maintained by all-white criminal justice system that excused violence and lynching against blacks. It took the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s to finally end slavery by another name. The civil rights movement was an intense and costly struggle that made great strides in our society toward justice for all. This surface of the water looked much calmer, but there were still swirling undercurrents beneath. The laws appeared mostly unbiased on their face, but they were applied unequally, and past harms went uncorrected. 100 years of segregation left most neighborhoods and schools racially divided. 100 years of economic oppression left black families 100 years behind white families in income and wealth. Black men are stopped, arrested, charged, and convicted at much higher rates than white men, and sentenced to harsher sentences. We are equal in theory, but not in practice. The situation is like a large river with a smooth surface, but when people jump in to swim, the strong undertow tends to pull a certain group down and drown them. This moment today has brought the deep currents of our society bubbling and brawling to the surface. Deaths by racial violence have often served as a catalyst for demands for justice, yet this time feels different. In the decades since the Civil War, since the Civil Rights Movement, protests against racial injustice were attended mostly by the victims of the oppression. The protests were led or limited to a few cities. Today, however, protests against racial injustice are occurring everywhere in big cities and small towns. More importantly, this time, multitudes of people from all backgrounds and walks of life have joined this movement for change. A tipping point has been reached, and you are a part of it. We have united in solidarity to say enough is enough. The time has come for deep change below the surface. So we say together, enough is enough.
Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Enough is enough. Enough is enough.
Besides ending current unjust laws and inhumane practices, the law should craft solutions to cure the lingering inequities resulting from several hundred years of racial class system. Beyond the law itself, our society must transform. It is not enough to simply tolerate people different from us as the law requires. Instead, we must actively invite and welcome each other into our homes, our workplaces, our schools, our churches, our media, and public spaces. We must not be merely non-racist. We must be anti-racist. Silently accepting the status quo of exclusion and inequity is no longer acceptable, and it never was. If we are not part of the solution, we must be part of the problem. We hope that America is finally beginning the long overdue process of racial reconciliation. To heal any injured relationship requires we restore trust between one another. But trust is earned, and this requires honesty, including about the past. We must therefore acknowledge that the belief by white people that they were racially superior led them to impose slavery, led them to fight a civil war to preserve that slavery, and led them to use systematic, legalized oppression and violence for another 100 years after the Civil War. We must acknowledge the lingering consequences of this racial class system on us today. Only in confronting these hard truths can we move forward. One small but necessary part of this process of truth and reconciliation is to remove public symbols placed in the past which were meant to celebrate white supremacy and intentionally include and demean others. That's what this statue represents. Placing such flags and monuments in museums allows us to preserve them as lessons of a destructive past. That way, future generations will learn the horrors of what happened so they can avoid the same tragic mistakes. Yeah. These statues must come down. Now, let me explain. I'm talking to the city council when I say that because, in all seriousness, they are going to have the last word. The court can remove the injunction. The court can nullify the injunction that prevents it from being moved. But that statute is owned by the city, and our legislative branch, the city council, has the last say on whether it's going to be moved or not. Woo! So I say again, these statues must come down. When a city agrees to remove their symbols of racism, it shows the process of racial truth and reconciliation has begun. An object symbolizing division becomes an act representing unity. Whereas protesting these monuments when they were built risked getting one lynched, now the evil they represent unites people in opposition to that evil. Indeed, we are protesting a statue built to glorify the concept of racial superiority. The diversity and size of rallies in this movement reveals the growing desire in our city to reject the past practices of racial oppression and the vile ideas used to defend them. Instead, we now embrace all people as having equal inherent worth, as stated in our Declaration of Independence. Our public symbols must reflect this value if our democracy is to survive and flourish. This statue must come down. Some people suggest that moving a statue to a museum is erasing history. That is a false argument. Just as moving a book from one library to another library does not erase that book. And ironically, moving a statue to a museum allows more to be told about the person, not less. Alfred Mouton was an enslaver, a leading enforcer of enslavement in this parish, and a war criminal who committed large-scale atrocities against black people. You know, in the Civil War, when the black soldiers were captured, they were not put in some detention camp. They were shot because they were black. The South did not shoot the white captives. Alfred Mouton does not reflect the values of our community. But he can be used to teach about the hatred he stood for. To put it bluntly, if a human trafficker today kidnapped your daughter and sold her to be systematically raped as a means of profit, how would you feel if a statue was built to honor that kidnapper? Likewise, we must acknowledge the pain that monuments to white supremacy were intended to inflict and continue to inflict on our community. We cannot have reconciliation without truth. This statue must come down. This statue must come down. This statue must come down. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Movements take years. Long after this statue is placed in a museum, we will need courage and stamina to continue in turbulent times to transform our world into a peaceful and equitable place of liberty and justice for all. Through that struggle, our children will see that by loving your neighbor as yourself, regardless of their skin color or other superficial differences, we shall overcome." At that point, then, our nation will finally then live up to its motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. But for us to be one, that statue must come down. I have fought this good fight my entire life. To paraphrase Martin, even if I don't make it to the mountaintop with you, I hope I at least live to see the day that our community achieves its first critical step toward truth and reconciliation, victory over this monument hatred.
Yes.
Thank you.